The last moments of someone's life hold a weight that can never be erased. There's something haunting about the final words of those who knew their fate was sealed, whispers of regret, eerie predictions, or terrifying realizations that linger long after they're gone. Some are captured in recordings, others overheard by loved ones, but all carry the chilling truth that, at that moment, they knew there was no escape. It was a cold morning in 1972 when Flight 217 took off from Chicago, heading for Denver. Among the passengers was James Calloway, a businessman in his late 40s. He had a sharp mind, a love for numbers, and a strict routine. This flight was just another trip for him. But something was different that morning. His hands trembled as he fastened his seatbelt. He felt an unexplainable dread clawing at his chest. The plane climbed to cruising altitude, and for a while, everything seemed normal. Then, about an hour into the flight, passengers heard a loud bang from the right wing. A few moments later, the cabin lights flickered, and the aircraft lurched. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. The flight attendants tried to stay calm, but the fear in their eyes told another story. James gripped his armrest. He turned to the young woman beside him and, with a hollow voice, muttered, "This is it. We won't make it." She tried to reassure him, forcing a nervous smile. "Planes have turbulence all the time," she said, though her own hands were shaking. James shook his head. "No. Something's wrong." Seconds later, the right engine burst into flames. A collective scream erupted through the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped, and the plane tilted sharply to one side. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, strained but steady, "Brace for impact." James closed his eyes. He didn't scream, didn't panic. He just whispered the same words again. "This is it. We won't make it." The plane never made it to Denver. It crashed in a remote field, killing 94 passengers on impact. The young woman sitting beside James survived, though barely. When she woke up in the hospital days later, his words still echoed in her mind. She swore that in those final seconds before impact, James wasn't afraid. It was as if he had already accepted his fate, like he had seen it coming long before anyone else. And that's what still haunts her to this day. Some people claim to sense their own death before it happens. A lingering feeling, a shadow over their thoughts, an unshakable certainty that their time is running out. And sometimes, their final words confirm that eerie intuition in ways that are impossible to ignore. In 1996, 28-year-old Rebecca Moore worked late nights at a small diner off Highway 19 in rural Kentucky. She was well-liked, known for her sharp wit and friendly nature, but in the weeks leading up to her death, she wasn't herself. She grew distant, quieter. She often looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be there. When asked what was wrong, she just shook her head and muttered, "I don't have much time left." Her co-workers dismissed it as exhaustion, but Rebecca became more and more convinced. She told a friend that she kept dreaming of walking through the woods, hearing whispers behind her. In the dream, she'd turn around, but there was nothing there, just a growing feeling of dread. Every night, the dream ended the same way, a sharp pain in her back and the overwhelming certainty that she was dying. On the night of March 14th, Rebecca finished her shift just after 2 a.m. She was the last to leave, locking up as usual. The security camera outside the diner caught her walking to her car. Just before she got in, she froze. For a full 5 seconds, she stood motionless, staring into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Then, almost as if speaking to someone who wasn't there, she whispered, "Oh God, it's you." That was the last time anyone saw Rebecca Moore alive. Her car was found the next morning, parked exactly where she left it. The keys were still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, no signs of forced entry. It was as if she had simply vanished. A week later, her body was discovered in the very woods she had dreamt about. She had been stabbed once in the back, just as she had described. There was no evidence, no suspects, and to this day, the case remains unsolved. But one detail still haunts those who knew those last words. Not just because she seemed to recognize her killer, but because she had predicted her death long before it happened. On October 20, 1977, The band boarded a Convair CV-240 aircraft for what was supposed to be a routine flight to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The plane was old, the engines unreliable, but the band had used it before. No one expected anything to go wrong, except for one person. Walter McCreary, the plane's co-pilot, had been uneasy about the aircraft for weeks. He had told a mechanic just 2 days before the flight, "This plane is a death trap. One day, it's not gonna make it." Whether it was a gut feeling or knowledge of the plane's technical issues, no one knows. But what happened next proved him right. Shortly after takeoff, the pilots noticed something was wrong. Fuel was disappearing faster than it should have been, and the left engine began sputtering. McCreary and the captain, William Gray, radioed air traffic control, requesting an emergency landing. But before they could reach an airport, the right engine also lost power. As the plane descended uncontrollably, McCreary's last recorded words over the radio were chilling. "We're going down. Tell them I told you so." Those on the ground could hear the terror in his voice just moments before the radio cut to static. The plane crashed into a densely wooded area in Mississippi, killing 6 people, including band members Ronnie Van Zant, Steve Gaines, and Cassie Gaines. McCreary himself did not survive. When investigators reached the site, they discovered that the aircraft had run out of fuel mid-air, exactly as McCreary had feared. Many believe he knew all along that the plane was doomed. His warnings were ignored, and in the end, his final words became an eerie prophecy. But what makes it even more unsettling? The aircraft's mechanic later admitted that McCreary had approached him the night before the flight and whispered, "If I don't come back, remember what I said." In 1983, a young man named Daniel Kramer walked into a New York City diner, looking pale and unsettled. He had been a regular at the diner for years, but on this particular evening, something was different. He sat at the counter, barely touching his coffee, his hands shaking. The waitress, Carol, noticed his distress and asked if he was okay. Daniel looked up at her with an expression she would never forget. "I don't have much time left," he whispered. "I saw it. I saw how I die." Carol laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. But Daniel wasn't smiling. He told her about a recurring dream he'd been having for the past week, one where he was walking home, only to hear footsteps behind him. No matter how fast he moved, the footsteps kept pace. Then, in his dream, he would reach his apartment door, only for a hand to grab him from behind. That was always where the dream ended. Carol tried to reassure him, but Daniel simply shook his head. He paid for his coffee and left the diner. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Later that night, Daniel was found in the alley behind his apartment building, dead. No wallet, no valuables missing, nothing to indicate a robbery. Just a single bruise on his neck, as if someone had grabbed him from behind. When police questioned Carol, she could barely speak. Daniel had told her what would happen just hours before it did. His last words in the diner haunted her for the rest of her life. But the strangest part? Witnesses in the building claimed they heard Daniel talking to someone just minutes before he died. Yuri Lipsky was an experienced diver. He had trained for years, mastering the depths of the ocean, but nothing could prepare him for his final dive into the Blue Hole in Dahab, Egypt. Known as one of the most dangerous diving sites in the world, the Blue Hole had already claimed the lives of many. But Lipsky, confident in his skills, descended with a helmet-mounted camera, unknowingly recording his own death. At first, everything seemed normal. He descended past the 30-meter mark, deeper and deeper into the abyss. But then, something went wrong. He was sinking too fast. His breathing became panicked. At around 100 meters, far beyond the safe limit, his body was overwhelmed by nitrogen narcosis, a state that causes disorientation and hallucinations. In the footage later recovered, Lipsky's voice can be heard through his labored breathing. His last coherent words were gasped through the regulator. "I can't. I can't." Then, silence. The camera captured him struggling, his hands reaching for something that wasn't there. He fumbled with his buoyancy controls, but it was too late. His body spiraled downward, his movements becoming sluggish as the lack of oxygen and pressure took over. When his lifeless body was later retrieved, Divers found his camera still attached, preserving the chilling final moments of a man who realized, far too late, that he was doomed. As Yuri Lipsky's body sank deeper into the abyss, the weight of his fate became undeniable. The camera attached to his helmet continued rolling, capturing every haunting second of his struggle. At nearly 115 meters, his limbs slowed, his frantic movements reduced to weak, aimless gestures. His breathing, once panicked, grew eerily slow, each exhale forming small bubbles that drifted upward, toward a surface he would never reach. In the recovered footage, there was a moment of stillness. A final pause before his body stopped moving altogether. Some say the last sound captured was a faint sigh, a resigned breath as if, in his final moments, he understood there was no escape. By the time rescue divers reached him hours later, it was long over. His lifeless form had settled against the sandy bottom, his eyes still open behind his mask. When they recovered the camera, no one expected what they would find. The footage was examined, studied by professionals and curious onlookers alike. Some who watched claimed to have felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they could feel the terror in Lipsky's last moments. Others insisted that, in the last few seconds of the video, just as the screen darkens, there is a whisper. A voice. Not Lipsky's. Something else. What it says remains unknown. Even now, experienced divers warn against descending too deep into the blue hole, calling it a graveyard beneath the waves. And those who have watched the video of Lipsky's final dive say one thing in common. Once you hear his last breath, you'll never forget it. In 1979, a Japan Airlines cargo plane, Flight 1628, was preparing for departure. Among the crew was flight engineer Yoshio Tsukuba, a veteran of the skies with decades of experience. As he completed his routine checks, something unsettled him. The aircraft felt wrong. Before boarding, he reportedly told a colleague, "I have a bad feeling about this flight. Something isn't right." It wasn't unusual for pilots or engineers to get nervous before flights, but Yoshio's unease was different. He even hesitated as he walked toward the aircraft, turning back briefly as if reconsidering. But duty called, and he climbed aboard. What happened next remains one of Japan Airlines' most chilling disasters. 30 minutes into the flight, Yoshio's fears became reality. At 35,000 feet, the aircraft experienced a sudden, catastrophic malfunction. The cockpit instruments flickered, the controls became unresponsive, and within moments, the plane went into a rapid descent. As the pilots fought desperately to regain control, the aircraft plunged toward the mountains below. The last recorded communication from the cockpit was a chilling phrase from Yoshio himself. "This is it. It's over." The radio cut out. Moments later, Flight 1628 crashed into the rugged mountains of Hokkaido. There were no survivors. Rescue teams found the wreckage scattered across the mountainside, the fuselage torn apart, the blackened remains of what had once been a fully operational aircraft. The most unsettling detail? Investigators found Yoshio's seat completely crushed, his body still strapped in, as if frozen in time. A strange rumor emerged among the search teams. Some rescuers claimed they heard a faint voice when they approached the wreckage. A man's voice, whispering a single phrase in Japanese. "I told you so." Even decades later, pilots and flight engineers speak of Yoshio's final words as a grim reminder. Sometimes, the feeling of doom isn't just paranoia. In 1983, a young man named Daniel Kramer walked into a New York City diner, looking pale and unsettled. He had been a regular at the diner for years, but on this particular evening, something was different. He sat at the counter, barely touching his coffee, his hands shaking. The waitress, Carol, noticed his distress and asked if he was okay. Daniel looked up at her with an expression she would never forget. "I don't have much time left," he whispered. "I saw it. I saw how I die." Carol laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. But Daniel wasn't smiling. He told her about a recurring dream he'd been having for the past week, one where he was walking home, only to hear footsteps behind him. No matter how fast he moved, the footsteps kept pace. Then, in his dream, he would reach his apartment door, only for a hand to grab him from behind. That was always where the dream ended. Carol tried to reassure him, but Daniel simply shook his head. He paid for his coffee and left the diner. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Later that night, Daniel was found in the alley behind his apartment building, dead. No wallet, no valuables missing, nothing to indicate a robbery. Just a single bruise on his neck, as if someone had grabbed him from behind. When police questioned Carol, she could barely speak. Daniel had told her what would happen just hours before it did. His last words in the diner haunted her for the rest of her life. But the strangest part? Witnesses in the building claimed they heard Daniel talking to someone just minutes before he died. A low voice, answering back. Yet security footage showed Daniel walking home alone. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved.